Welcome to Building Zero Friction Apps using the Teams platform with single sign-on and Microsoft Graph. I'm Nick Kramer, Principal Program Manager on the Teams platform. So we'll talk about four features here. First is single sign-on with Azure Active Directory for your tabs and your bots. Next, we'll talk about conditional access policies for tabs. Then granular permissions for Graph APIs. And finally, resource-specific consent for how to use Graph APIs without involving an admin. Let's check out a video on single sign-on. Before single sign-on, tabs really liked you to log in a lot. Even though you're logged into Microsoft Teams, you had to then log in separately to each of your tabs, which gets old pretty quickly. With single sign-on, it works exactly as you expect. You're already logged into Teams, therefore you're already logged into your tabs. And it works on mobile as you expect as well. We're also bringing single sign-on to bots. And since you already know what not logging in looks like, let's show what happens if you also need to log in and ask for permissions at the same time. This app needs the permission to read your calendar because that's what this app does. And so it needs your permission. And so you now see a Teams UI to ask for that permission. And once you accept that permission, that UI disappears and gets out of your way. So you no longer have to see that in your conversation view. And here we get to prove that this app, in fact, has those permissions. Now let's log in again to another Teams client and show that you don't have to log in a second time or ask for permission a second time because you already granted that permission earlier. It remembers those permissions that you granted. So that's Azure Active Directory single sign-on. Users never need to sign into your app again as long as your app supports single sign-on. And this is a wonderful simplification for authentication. Permissions is a separate story. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But for authentication, it's just wonderful not having to log in over and over again. You're going to see this roll out in two waves. First, we're going to support tab authentication, which is already available in developer preview and will be rolling out broadly in the next few weeks. And then we're going to follow that up with single sign-on for bots and messaging extensions. And while I really want to emphasize the end user experience this creates, it's also a great simplification for developers as well, because you can now do your authentication logic in a single API call. You call Microsoft Teams.authentication.getAuthToken, and you just pass in two things, what to do if it succeeds and what to do if it fails. So now all that authentication logic in one API call. Some tips and tricks when working with single sign-on. The first is just to match up your URLs. Your tab is associated with the URL. In your Teams app manifest, you declare your tab as belonging to a certain URL. That URL needs to have the same domain name as your Azure App ID registration. We don't want to be giving credentials to someone else's website to you. That website can't end in azurewebsites.net today. When we created the feature, we were a little overly paranoid about fly-by-night websites and people recycling their website name, registering a name, then unregistering it, forgetting about it, that sort of thing. So we didn't support azurewebsites.net. We are lifting that restriction, but it has not been lifted yet. So something to keep in mind if you want to try it today. Third thought here is that getAuthToken, that API I showed you on that last slide, it only provides authentication permissions. You will get back a token that gives you just enough permission to figure out who the signed in user is. If you want additional permissions, such as that calendar read example, you need to do a little extra work. In that case, you'll need to manually tell Azure AD to pop up a consent dialog, the same way you've always done this. Then you will call getAuthToken, and then you will exchange that auth token for a better auth token that has additional permissions that have been consented. And you do that with the Azure Active Directory on behalf of Flow. So to learn more about that, there's this great skilling session called Tips for Teams Developers, Authentication and Proactive Messaging that tells you everything you ever wanted to know and more about SSO. We're also pleased to announce the impending release of conditional access for tabs. Conditional access policies allow admins to create restrictions on who's allowed to sign into which app under which conditions. There's a whole bunch of different policies you can create. And it includes things like this user can only log in during these hours of the day, not on weekends, not at midnight. And also another popular one is being able to access only from a trusted device. You can only access this app using a trusted device. In the past, Teams tabs were not considered a trusted device. You could run Teams on a trusted device, but things running inside Teams as tabs were not on trusted devices, according to Azure AD. We fixed that, allowing you to roll out those conditional access policies and make your app and your domain more secure. We're also pleased to announce the availability of granular permissions for the Teams Graph APIs. In the past, the Teams Graph APIs, almost all the Teams Graph APIs required one of two permissions, group read all or group read write all, two very powerful permissions. And it led to some silly situations like, I need my app to be able to send a message, therefore I need the permission to be able to delete all teams, please. That's a pretty scary place to be. It puts admins in an awkward situation. To fix that, we've created more than 24 new permissions to give you the granularity you need. Just to hammer that home, with group read write all, it's really this all or nothing model. Would you like this app to have access to nothing, or would you like it to be able to read and write all teams and all parts of the team? With granular permissions, we can scope that down to a part of a team. This app has access only to the channel names, not the channel messages, not the membership of the team, not all the other parts of the team, just the channel names. Now, most of these new granular permissions are .all permissions. They grant you permissions to all teams or some part of all teams. So all the channel messages in all teams, the channel names in all teams. And so they do require admin consent because only admins are able to give permission on behalf of all teams. There are some interesting exceptions we've created. Team.readbasic.all and channel.readbasic.all both give you very limited information. They tell you the name and the description of the team and channel, and that's it. And so that's reasonable for users to consent to. And that allows you to create powerful experiences like a team and channel picker, such as you see in the Share to Teams widget. The next evolution of this is a feature we call Resource-Specific Consent, or RSC for short, and we're pleased to announce that's now available in developer preview. With Resource-Specific Consent, you can narrow those permissions even further and give that application access to only one team. This app can read the channel names from Team 2, not from Team 3, not from Team 4, not from Team 1, just Team 2. And that allows some really powerful things, because once you narrow that down, you can start talking about non-admins giving consent. If it's just one team, you have this person called the team owner who can give consent to one team's worth of stuff. To see an example of this, let's check out Zapier. Zapier has been working with us to improve the integration of their product with Microsoft Teams. They have a great workflow automation service, and they started out without resource-specific consent. And let's see what that experience looks like without resource-specific consent. You try to install Zapier. It needs the grouped read-write-all, the ability to read and write messages and create channels, but it doesn't tell you that up front. Instead, you install your app, you think you have a working app, you go to run it, then you try to sign in, and then it surprises you. Need admin approval, because it needs group read-write-all, and you're not an admin, so you're just left out in the cold, wishing you were an admin. With resource-specific consent, it actually asks you up front. It says, hey, read messages in this team, create channels in this team, read the team settings. And when the team owner adds this app, the app actually works. the team owner has now granted permission to do those things it asked about. So when you sign into Teams, it actually works. And once it's installed into a team, we can even switch over to the website for Zapier, and the Zapier website has the same access. So let's finish setting up a Zap I started writing earlier. Here we're going to write a Zap that when you create a new task list, it will create a new channel for that task list. And we've connected it to the sales and marketing team. And let's skip testing. Who needs testing? Things always work the first time, right? And when we run this, we're going to create a new task list, build 2020. And then thanks to Zapier, a new channel is going to appear where we can talk about that tasks and what we need to do to meet those obligations. And then there's another Zap I also configured earlier to put a new message in the channel to get that conversation started. So there we have it. Thanks to resource-specific consent, Zapier is now able to create teams and channels, or create channels and post messages to those channels without having to pull an admin into the flow. All right, so here's some of the new permissions we're introducing with resource-specific consent. I won't read these all to you, but the highlights include being able to create and delete channels, being able to read channel messages and also be notified of new channel messages, being able to read and write tabs, and access to the membership of the team. So how do you get this wonderful RSC thing, you say? First step is you need to update your Teams app manifest to tell us about your permission needs. There's a web application info section you'll need to either edit or add to your application manifest. And inside there's two key things. There's the ID, that is, what is the ID of the Graph app ID that you're using for your Graph stuff. This is also, by the way, the same information you need to pass with single sign-on, is what is your Graph app ID. And then the second part is your application permissions. What RSC permissions does your app need? In this case, channel.delete.group, apparently it doesn't create channels, just deletes them. Channel message.read.group and teamsapp.read.group. The .group, by the way, tells you it's an RSC permission. Under the covers, all teams are actually part of groups, and so that's why it's a .group rather than .team, because other things under the covers, other workloads as well as teams participate in that group, such as SharePoint and OneNote and Planner, etc. So that's why it's a .group there. So step one was update your app manifest. Step two is get a token the same way you've always got application permission tokens. You post to loginmicrosoftonline.com, you pass a tenant ID, you pass an app ID, you pass your app secret proving that you own that app, and then you get back a token. One thing in particular you don't pass in is you don't need to say what team you're interested in getting a token for. You get back a token that gives you access to all the teams you have access to. And then step three is call an API the same way you've always called APIs. You call the same APIs, you pass in your token using the authorization header, and away you go. Some tips and tricks when working with resource-specific consent. Keep in mind the mantra, team owners grant access to team data. So 3 key parts of that. First is team owners. If you're not a team owner, you're not allowed to add people to the team, and you're not allowed to add apps to the team. Only the team owner can grant access to the team. That's what makes them an owner. Second thing is it has to be team data. So chats, one-on-one and group chats, they're not team data. So you can't use resource-specific consent because there is no team owner for a one-on-one chat. More subtly, private channels are not part of RSC because the team owner doesn't necessarily have access to the private channel. You can actually create a private channel that the team owner does not have access to, and it would be pretty weird if the team owner could grant access to something that the team owner doesn't have access to themselves. So for that reason, private channels don't get access with resource-specific consent. And the third part of this is you can't use resource-specific consent to create new teams because you can't grant access to a team that doesn't exist yet. So the catch-22 there. So team owners grant access to team data. Second thing to keep in mind is application permissions. You're working with application permissions rather than delegated permissions, meaning that when you do an API call, Graph has no idea what user you're doing that on behalf of, or if you're doing that on behalf of a user. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, and you should think about what the right thing is for your scenario. So in our earlier example, we showed creating a channel. Team owners could change a setting in the team that says regular users cannot create channels. Should your application be able to create a channel then? If a regular user clicked, or if a regular user built that task list, should your app create a channel? You need to think about your scenario and what makes sense for your application, because that can go both ways. It could be that, hey, the team owner said no one else can create channels, and therefore your app shouldn't be creating channels for those other users. Or it could be that the team owner said, I don't trust regular people to create channels, but I do trust this application I set up to create the right kinds of channels with the right process under the right circumstances. So that's a decision you need to think through and just make an intentional decision there. Third thing to keep in mind is that you can mix and match permissions. You can have an application that uses both delegated permissions and RSC permissions, and even classic application permissions if you want. If you mix delegated permissions with RSC permissions, you will end up with multiple tokens. You'll have a delegated token and an application permission token, and you'll need to decide which token to use for any given API call. But it makes for a really powerful combination where you can do some really interesting things. And so I encourage you to check that out and explore that possibility as you're designing your app. For the admins in the crowd, we have a great set of controls for you. First thing to know is if user consent was off in your tenant, then RSC is also off in your tenant. So there's that first slider there. Users can consent to apps accessing company data on their behalf. If you've had that to off, then RSC has defaulted to off. But you can change it to whatever value you want. There's that second slider. Users can consent to apps accessing company data for the groups they own. That is RSC. So you can do whatever combination you want. You can have RSC on and regular user consent off. You can have regular user consent on and RSC off. Not sure why you'd do that. It hurts my feelings, but you can do that. And there's a third possibility that's interesting as well, which is RSC limited, which means you specify a list of users who are allowed to use RSC. So if you have some team owners you trust and other team owners you don't trust as much, this is a great option for you. Resource-specific consent also supports all those other teams controls you've grown to be accustomed with. So if you say no third-party apps in my tenant, then that also means no third-party resource-specific consent apps. If you turn on or off custom apps, you also turn on or off custom RSC apps. And similarly with app permission policy. App permission policy is a great way to control which users are allowed to run which apps, and that applies to RSC as well. When team owner is not allowed to run an app, they're also not allowed to install it. So nice simple tie-in. And then one last note about custom apps. For regular users, for non-admin users, when you upload a custom app, if your tenant supports custom apps, if your custom app uses RSC, we do insist that that custom app comes from the same tenant that you're uploading it to. So basically, we're insisting that your custom app is actually custom, and you're not trying to install some app you downloaded off the internet from some other untrustable place. And that's just an extra security measure in there. If you're an admin, you're allowed to do this because it is actually useful for admins to sometimes pull in apps from other tenants in a very limited trial basis. But we want to make sure there's an admin involved in pulling in apps from other tenants into your tenant. All right, so coming soon, we will have PowerShell commandlets for installing RSC apps. Today in the beta PowerShell commandlet module, there is already a command for add Teams app installation. takes an app ID and a team ID and installs an app to a team. We will soon make the permissions flag actually work. I think it's actually there, but doesn't work today. And the way that's going to work is you specify the maximum permissions you're willing to give this app. And if you try to install an app that asks for those permissions or less, the installation succeeds. If you try to install an app that wants more, it fails. So you never end up installing an app that has more permissions than you expected it to. All right, to summarize what we've learned here today, with Azure Active Directory Single Sign-On, also known as SSO, you don't need to log into your apps over and over again. On the authorization side, we've added support for conditional access for tabs. We've added granular permissions for the Teams Graph APIs, and we've added resource-specific consent to use Graph APIs without involving admins. There's a lot of other great content at Build I encourage you to check out that's related to this. We talked about that upper left one, tips for Teams developers going into SSO and authentication. On the right-hand side, there's a pair of great talks from the Azure Active Directory folks, a blueprint for building trustworthy apps that reach millions of users, and creating trustworthy applications with Microsoft Identity that go over publisher verification and consent policies. Some other wonderful options for admins to give further control over who can run what when. All right, with that, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Eunice Lowe, to talk us through some questions.
Thanks, Nick. Some really exciting news. It looks like there's quite a bit of chat in the chats from our viewers here.
All right.
Our first question that came in, does the SSO token flow to bot task modules as well?
Say that again?
Does the single sign-on token flow to bot task modules as well?
Does the single sign-on flow to bot modules as well, to task modules as well? Yes, it will. That's not part of the initial, as I said, there's two waves of rolling this out. And first we do tabs, and then we'll do bots and task modules and message extensions. But yes, when we do the bot part, yes, we will include task modules.
Thank you. Next up, we have a question that goes, when will we have granular security and connectors in the G Cloud? Right now, it's all connectors for everyone or none?
I'm trying to parse that question. The G Cloud, that's confusing me.
I have a feeling they mean the government clouds.
Oh, I don't believe it works any differently in government clouds than it does in public clouds. I think by connectors, I think you're meaning we have too many things called connectors at Microsoft. You mean the Teams connectors that you can set up as part of an application, a Teams app, and that's. I don't think we're doing anything different for the government part there.
Sounds good. Our next question from our viewers, is this JavaScript only, no C#? Is it possible to do Teams tabs apps that will be server-side content loaded, but beside using the Graph API to single sign-on?
Yeah, so yes, you can use C#. I guess I didn't show this demo here. My other app that I use a lot in demos is my Q&A tracker, which is an ASP.NET application with almost all server-side logic. There's a little bit of logic that has to be client-side. There's a little bit of code you need to write to actually pop the authentication prompt, so that get auth call, for instance, is actually a client-side code. And then the actual popping of the auth prompt is basically the only thing you have to do on the client side. Everything else, including some of the other authentication and authorization logic, can be server side if you want. For tabs, I'll be honest, I'm still kind of getting my head around what's possible from a performance standpoint, but that really has nothing to do with authentication and authorization. That's just a perf argument of, can you get the speed and latency that customers expect in a tab if you have a lot of server-side code.
Thank you. Next up, are there any plans to create any tooling to scan a graph application and determine a minimum permission set?
Yeah, that sounds like a loaded question. Do you know something about this topic? No, yes, it's something we've talked about. No, it's not something we plan to release imminently to scan a graph app. The biggest challenge there is that there's no easy way to tell what permission an app needs until you actually run it and exhaust all code paths. So we do have every now and then we run kind of telemetry games and see on what percentage of apps out there seem to need the permissions that they run with, and certainly some of them have more permissions than they need. But turning that into a tool that we can then deliver to developers is a fairly tall order, and we have not done that yet.
Okay. We actually have a response from our viewers on the clarification on G Cloud. We got they meant the Google Cloud, actually.
Well, that confuses me even more, honestly.
Well, let's start with the next question. This next one's not to make life difficult for you. Now we have a two-parter. Is resource-specific consent being looked at by other workloads in M365, such as SharePoint Online? Would love for an application to interact with only a specific site, for instance. And part two, will RSC be expanded to other app permissions like mailboxes or SharePoint Online?
So yeah, the short answer to both questions is we are looking at it and we have nothing to announce at this time. Yes, we are thinking about whether this sort of concept makes sense in other sorts of applications, and also whether it makes sense with additional graph APIs. And we've designed it to make sense for all those things, but then it's just a question of what time frame do we bring this in for additional graph APIs.
Thank you. With that, I think that's the end of the questions. So I hope everyone's having a great time at Microsoft Build. Again, don't forget to check out our other sessions, aka.ms/M365 SK 102, 106, and 109. Hope everyone's having as much fun as I am, and everyone have a great day.
Thanks for joining us. This has been real fun. Thank you.